This episode of Shadiversity is brought to you by the Castles shirt, because castles are awesome and you want to let your friends know that not only are they awesome, but you know that they are awesome, as evidenced by this awesome shirt with an awesome castle on it. But not just any castle, I'm talking about a historically accurate, properly designed, high-detailed castle with all the bells and whistles. Available through Teespring, link in the description.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and welcome back to my series where I take a look at the classic fantasy races and, depending on their physical characteristics, try and figure out what medieval weapons, historical medieval weapons, would be best suited to them. And in this episode, we'll be looking at the little guys. And I'm kind of saying, little guys being a bit more broad, because really in terms of physical characteristics, Hobbits, Halflings, and say Gnomes, they're basically the same in terms of physical characteristics. Now, there might be different cultural characteristics. One race might be more inclined to certain types of behaviors based on their culture and other things like that. And though that's important, it's not the main focus of this analysis. It comes in now and then, but the main focus is the physical characteristics. And in terms of the physical characteristics, Gnomes, Halflings, Hobbits, and really even goblins, okay, depending on what size you give to the goblins, they kind of play into the same thing, but I'm going to kind of keep goblins off to the side because generally goblins, in my opinion, are shown to being a bit more agile than, say, Halflings and Gnomes. But they will have the same limitations and drawbacks in regards to strength, and that's the big thing. Like, with all the other fantasy races we've looked at, we've had to try and establish what are the general physical characteristics, because as we know, things change in different fantasy settings. And so this analysis isn't going to be 100% representative of every single fantasy setting, and classic medieval fantasy setting, that's what I'm talking about. It's not going to be representative of every single one. But I hope to find the most general and representative interpretation of these creatures that we can then apply to other fantasies, even if my conclusions wouldn't directly apply. In regards to these little guys, strength really is the issue. It's going to be around half as strong as a regular human, and to what level of movement, like a little under half, a little above half, it'll be around there. Now, this would affect combat to a very significant degree, dependent on the type of creatures you're fighting, but with all these analysis, I've really been comparing level of effectiveness against humans, the base level, this is what we can understand, and other humanoid-like creatures. Now, this brings up the question of how effective is strength in combat with medieval weapons. And it's interesting. Strength can be, very significant, and at the other side of the coin, not as much as you might think. It's a very sophisticated subject. Now, the reason why I'm going into how it would affect the way they fight is because the way they fight would determine the type of weapons they would use. Now, in unarmed combat, strength is a very large determining factor in the level of lethality that a person can produce. It would be very hard for someone with the strength of a child, and if you look at a child half the size of a human, you can kind of gauge strength level based on that, but I think halflings, gnomes, and if we look at goblins as well, they would be a bit stronger than the average child because they have more time for their muscles and body to develop. But still, it's a bit of a basis that we can work off of, and it would be very hard for a child to kill an adult with their bare hands. Now, when you add weapons into the picture, that changes things up quite a lot. All a person needs, even if they're the size of a child, is a rock, a big enough rock in their hands, and their lethality but potential has become 100%. They will be able to kill someone with this weapon, and then if you add something far more lethal than a rock, say like a dagger or indeed a sword, well then these little guys, yes, they will be very much able to kill larger people, because it does not need a lot of strength or force to slit someone's throat or stab them through the heart. But when someone is able to defend themselves, things change very significantly, because even though these little guys would be able to kill, their ability to get around the opponent's reach and block and engage in fighting with these other people and stuff like that who have greater strength, their ability to resist, deflect blows and stuff like that would be greatly reduced. And I've mentioned how significant reach is in these analyses. Very often reach is profoundly important, and they don't have this. Now, could they use polearms and stuff like that to try and overcome their reach disadvantage, like what I was saying with dwarves? Well, the issue is they do have less physical strength, and depending on types of polearms, poleaxes and stuff like that, they can be pretty heavy on the top end. So even their equivalent of polearms would have to be built to their size to make them more manageable, which means again they would be less effective. And in regards to all other weapons, swords, axes, especially if these weapons are built to their size, it gives them a huge disadvantage that if they are going up against any competent warrior, if they're human or any of the other races, their chances of victory is very slim. And I'm not saying they couldn't win. If they're smart enough and they're skilled enough and they're able to trick their opponent, make them make mistakes and stuff like that, they could still win. But outside of those exceptions, it would be profoundly difficult, to the point that I believe them going into a fair one-on-one fight is almost suicidal. A very bad decision for these guys. Honestly, their best approach to combat would be to avoid it and fight dirty, okay? They can still kill their enemies, but not in a fair one-on-one fight. Outnumbering their opponents is going to be a massive benefit to them, and then also just sneaking them and hitting them when they're not ready. Now, interesting, being smaller means they are lighter, which also means that their footprint has less pressure, meaning they will be more soft or light of foot, so they could sneak easier. And also being smaller, and this is the classic thing, is everyone's kind of realized this, which is why it's mentioned so much in, game mechanics and other things that are based in medieval fantasies. Even, The Hobbit mentions how good hobbits are at sneaking, because they are smaller, and therefore being smaller, harder to notice in the corner of one's eye, as opposed to a larger object that is moving. So I agree completely with all this. Sneaking is, for these little guys, that is their number one tactic, or should be their number one tactic. And it really is in most fantasies. So again, these little guys would need to just fight smarter, fight more tactically if they really want to, engage in battle on a way that they can win. I was going to say an even foothold, but it's not even for them. They need to make it uneven so things skew in their favor. Greater numbers and stabbing him in the back, okay? Guerrilla warfare. Hit them when they're unprepared with their pants down, in the back, in the dark, when they're asleep. These guys they have to be the dirty fighting masters if they want to get anywhere with them. Now, with that in mind, what type of weapons is best suited for dirty fighting? Well, daggers are perfect. You see, in terms of lethality potential, daggers are just as lethal as swords, but in combat they are not as effective because of reach, leverage, and other things like that. A person using a dagger fighting someone using a sword is at a huge disadvantage. But take away resistance, the dagger is perfectly capable of killing someone just as effective as a sword, and in fact, it can be more preferable and convenient using a dagger over a sword. You see, the great thing that daggers have is their size that makes them more convenient and more concealable. That's why the dagger is the assassin's weapon. But that's in a non-combative situation. What if they actually do get in a fight? Well, as I've already said, a dagger against a sword is already at a disadvantage, and these guys have as much disadvantages already, so that you don't want to give them a worse situation. So no, I do not think they would use daggers in a one-on-one even kind of a fight. Yes, they could could use shields, but the shield would have to be sized to them. They wouldn't get the advantages that dwarves would get out of using shields, because dwarves have equivalent strength. But if the shield was properly weighted and sized to these, halflings and stuff, they would really need some level of protection like this. In regards to full plate armor, well, yes, I think they could absolutely wear full plate armor and gain just as much benefit from it from, the larger guys, because the armor should be half as, heavy for them, therefore as easy to wear. But their head would still be a very vulnerable target, because even with a helmet protecting you, a solid enough strike can transfer enough force to do injury to someone's head. And for humans fighting an opponent that is half their size, the opponent's head is going to be the primary target and easiest part on their opponent to hit. So even with full plate armor and a helm, I still think a shield would be preferable to try and deflect the blows that are coming in towards the head. Now with this shield, they would actually have quite a bit of protection, because for a human fighting someone so much shorter, they have far fewer target areas. In fact, if they have a shield with enough surface area that gives them enough kind of cover, they can just hold it on an angle above them, and it would be very hard to try and hit around that thing. The answer for that for a human would just be to boot the thing as hard as they can and send the little guy flying, so they really are at a big disadvantage. But still, they might be able to hold their ground if they're wearing enough armor and have a decent shield. And the advantage that they would have, there's not many, right? But one that they would get out of their side is that they have clear, aim for their opponent's legs. When you're fighting one-on-one with someone who is the same size as you, hitting the opponents in their legs is actually much harder, especially in sword fighting. Protecting your legs in your sword fighting I have found to be quite easy, because you just pull your legs back, lean a bit forward, and offend them with your sword, and already your legs, most of the time, are completely out of range for your opponent to hit. And you see, to hit an opponent's legs, you have to lower your arms so you can reach their bottom half, which means exposing your top half, which is a very bad thing in sword fighting and other types of combat. So this creates a situation in swordplay specifically, where most of the direct hits in sword fighting is to the waist and above. Now, having said that, I found it is advantageous to hit people in the legs, but when I say hit the legs, I'm usually getting strikes in on the thighs. I don't think in my entire life, in the practice of medieval combat and stuff like that, have I ever actually struck someone in the shin, because that part of the body is so far out of range. And I'm not saying you would not want to do that if the opportunity presented itself, but for these little guys, it's a prime target for them. And if they can just protect themselves and close the distance, they have, straight target right there into the legs. And that is also a vulnerable part for certain armaments and things like that. For even full plate, it's behind the knees that's vulnerable. And outside of full plate, usually male hauberks and stuff like that are only covered down to the thighs and stuff. There's many situations in many types of armaments where the legs aren't fully protected. Now, the best type of weapons to attack the legs really depend on what type of armaments the opponent is wearing on the legs. If the legs are unprotected, swords all the way. Doesn't take much force to be able to fully incapacitate someone's, knee, shin area, to the point where it'd be very difficult to walk on that thing. And if they are wearing armor, then clubs and maces. In my opinion, this really would be the prime tactic for these little guys. Go for the legs. Cut or club these giants down to their size, because as soon as they immobilize them, then the disparity in physical abilities is far closer, isn't it? And in terms of spears, now spears would give reach, but to hit, the legs are a harder target to hit. They're a smaller kind of cylindrical-like target with chances of deflection because it's round and stuff like that, which would make it much harder to hit with thrusts. But with a side-sweeping kind of chop, your chances of striking that area is far more likely, which means swords, in my opinion, would be better for them than, say, long pike spears or things like that. Now, I'm not saying pikes and spears wouldn't be useful to them, because then you could aim for the lower torso and stuff like that from a downwards angle. That could be useful. So it depends on what they're going for. If they're going for just the legs and ankles of their opponent, I reckon a sword is better, but still spears would be useful to them. So that's melee, but what about range? Now, sometimes it has been said that halflings are good at throwing things, And I know in certain Dungeons & Dragons editions they are given bonuses on throwing. Now, if they have natural, enhancements in their perception and stuff that could assist with that, and they have naturally better aim, yeah, okay. But in terms of their physical frame and size, they are not built for throwing. To throw something with lethal strength, it needs power behind it. But because these little guys have smaller arms, their hands move over a smaller distance when they try and throw something, which gives them less ability to achieve higher velocity in their hands for the object that they're throwing. And that's just their size. With less physical strength, they would also produce less power as well, which means these guys actually be pretty rubbish at throwing things compared to humans. This also applies with other ranged weapons such as archery. Now, it's funny, in all the fantasy races we've looked at, because they have differences to humans and some advantages here and there, nearly every single fantasy race so far would have more benefits in archery, as I see it, than humans. Dwarves, there's a bit more room to have debate on, but certainly elves and orcs, their physical characteristics are better suited to gain advantages out of archery than humans. Humans can still be pretty darn good, don't get me wrong, but hobbits, halflings, which are basically the same thing, gnomes, and even goblins, they are not built for archery, okay? They have a smaller draw span because they're smaller, and they have less strength, which means they would not be able to handle war bows, which is the strength of bow you would need to actually, penetrate mail and gambeson, and even then that's not a guarantee, because gambeson and mail can protect you against arrow fire. They would barely be able to handle hunting bows. Like a hunting bow to these guys would be their equivalent of a war bow. Now, can you kill people with hunting bows? Of course, but not if the, guys are wearing armor or anything like that. So using bows in a warfare scenario, they could, because it's certainly better than nothing, and ranged weapons is always, there's always a use for them, but not nearly as good as the other races. But the weapon that would be perfect for them to overcome their weaknesses in strength is a weapon that doesn't rely on strength, but also has a lot of power. And this is the crossbow. Absolutely, the crossbow, the perfect ranged weapon for halflings, gnomes, and I also think goblins as well. They would need a loading type of assist like the goat's foot lever or even the winch, but once it's all set up, my goodness, yes, crossbows are the perfect weapon for these little guys because it overcomes their strength, and if they do have advantage in aim, they say they're good at throwing, but I don't think throwing good for strength, but if they're better at aiming because they have natural abilities that assist with that, and mainly it's the halflings that are given this bonus, well then the crossbow, my goodness, absolutely. And those are my picks. The first and foremost thing is that I don't think these little guys would want to ever get into a fair fight because they're at such a big disadvantage. So dirty tactics, hitting in the back, outnumber their opponents and overwhelm them. That's the main thing they want to do. And of course, daggers are best suited for that. But if they ever get into an even more fight, they need a level of protection. So shields, if they can make them to be strong enough, and then getting in close and hitting people in the legs. So that means swords, in my opinion. And for ranged combat, crossbows. Thank you very much for watching. As always, it has been a great pleasure and joy. I hope to see you again, and until then, farewell.